Characters, plot, theme, style, conflict, and resolution. These are all components of narrative design in games, but to me, it's the setting of Dear Esther that is the defining feature of this walking simulator. Many of the games I like are generally fantasy or sci-fi based, with imaginary worlds, but the discovery that Dear Esther is inspired by a real place led me to dive deeper to learn about any real-life connections. What I discovered is whilst it's inspired by real-life places and events, it intentionally tries to confuse or destabilize players, even going as far as randomizing items in each map with each new playthrough. The game wants us to question reality, to ask the same question that many of us do when encountering the loss of someone precious. Did that really happen? Is this real? Are they really gone? And the reason why this all works is because the world is based on reality. It looks and feels like reality. It's based on a real location with historical references. But it's not all too realistic. There are clear indicators of being in a dreamlike state, or encountering hallucinations, or even the ending of a floating in the sky. Again, asking the question, is it real? If this was set somewhere imaginary, we wouldn't even think to question the story. A windswept Scottish biome, hallucinogenic caves, all peppered with Gaelic mythology and references to real-life events all combine to create storytelling perfection. This is a game that uses the environment to draw upon the parallels of grief, the state of denial. Dear Esther is a walking simulator game with pretty much no game mechanics, so the scenery and biomes are incredibly important for the player to feel truly immersed, as the voice actors play their part in unveiling the story.
My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another.
Whilst it's pretty clear that the world is set somewhere in the UK, I learned the specific location when investigating the trophies and saw many of the titles were in Scottish Gaelic, such as Seane, a water spirit, Shanachie, meaning historian or storyteller, Starkanaman, the name of the sea stack in Borroway, which is also the highest sea stack in Scotland, and Mullach an Eilean. This is where I did a quick bit of Googling, and I discovered Mullach an Eilean is the Scottish Gaelic name of a real place, a remote isle called Borroway in the St Kilda archipelago, all the way up in Scotland. The isle has been abandoned since 1930 after the residents all voted to leave, which feels like a beautiful and haunting place to ground the story of Dear Esther and ask the key questions. Do we abandon all hope and let ourselves atrophy when we feel we have lost purpose? Or do we keep pushing forward as hope is born when all is forlorn? In the first of 4 chapters, we are first met with an abandoned lighthouse. This gives an excellent indication of the current state of the island and sets up the notion you're alone on this journey and all you have to do is trust the narrator to be a reliable source of truth.
I've lost track of how long I've been here and how many visits I have made overall. Certainly the landmarks are now so familiar to me that I have to remind myself to actually see the forms and shapes in front of me. I could stumble blind across these rocks, the edges of these precipices, without fear of missing my step and plummeting down to sea. Besides, I have always considered that if one is to fall, it is critical to keep one's eyes firmly open.
This is also why it's so haunting when we see ghosts peppered throughout the game. As we pass the lighthouse, we are greeted with the core biome, what looks like the nearly exclusive UK sub-biome Heather Moorlands, in this case sitting upon a volcanic origin. Heather, dry grass foliage, and other flowers and brush are interwoven with cold, wet rocks lined with both sand and stone beaches at the base of the cliff walls. Creeks and rivers follow the contour lines, and evidence of landslides are present. No trees are here, and the wind is heavy and loud. It feels dastardly cold. This windswept biome feels plucked from the pages of Wuthering Heights and placed on the small Hebrides-inspired island to evoke the same feeling of solitude and isolation. As the main character ambles up the mountain path, this rocky barrier introduces bifurcating paths leading to pockets of caves. Their wall art with bright glowing turquoise patterns, lightly scattered and almost like tree branches, but with hints of a more modern human inscriptions. Here we have a hint of foreshadowing. The map's ending is celebrated by an ancient and iconic feature, a stone circle. This is a ring of standing stones, placed in the ground by ancient peoples, typically dating from the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The most famous being Stonehenge. These monuments are sacred sites, with connections to pagan religious practices and druidic traditions. But in reality, there seems to be no circles in Borere. However, it is whispered that a druid did live here. This is potentially connected to Donnelly's hunt for the famous hermit. Around these standing stones we find an urn. In each map there's a collectible achievement called Tuat, which is the Scottish Gaelic term for mourn or lament, which adds a nice haunting touch to the overall feel of this game world. And this is really the only game mechanic that Dear Esther contains. The next chapter is within the same biome, featuring the namesake, a buoy, or buoy, which emits a flash of light at key intervals, aiming to be a guide for ships. In the mouth of the bay is a shipwreck. It's unclear if the broken lighthouse caused the wreck and if the buoy was installed after the incident. Either way, it's likely that this is a reference to a real-life longliner named Spinningdale. It wrecked on an island called Herta, right near Borere. This ship's main engine stopped at a critical time when sheltering from severe weather conditions. This ship is likely a reference to Esther and Paul's accident, visually reinforcing the parallels of the ship's crash to Esther's. You encounter a house upon a hill, known as a bothy, and a mysterious figure lurking. Bothies are shelters that are left unlocked and free to use for any travellers. This is common in Scotland, where there's no concept of trespassing, and you're free to roam onto any land. In-game, the bothy was constructed in the 1700s by a man named Jacobson. Unfortunately, he met his tragic end contracting an illness from one of his goats while on a pursuit of finding a family. Donnelly had stayed in the bothy with some shepherds, and when they all left, the bothy was left to rot, again reinforcing the theme of choice and abandonment. Once making your way up, you start your descent down a cave for the penultimate map. As the narrator has fallen deep into a cave, this visually complements the notion of falling deep into depression and with the realization that he has to strive forward to get out. This may represent the choices we make to handle dire circumstances, move forward or give up. There are many caves in Scotland, several in St Kilda, most notably sea caves, where an abundance of life and nature reside. In Dear Esther, this cave features typical cave-like elements, small underground creeks, waterfalls, stone paths and sinkholes. However, this cave is more magical. Cold and wet walls are lined with beautiful glowing crystals and rock formations, yet the only life forms that are present are bioluminescent fungi. Rather than replicating the real-world caves, it feels enhanced with a dreamlike depiction of the claustrophobic structure. It feels like you're stepping into a Skyrim dungeon, with stalactites lining the ceiling of the cave and fenced off by their cousins, stalagmites. The paths are narrow, connected by large chambers, much like the design of an ant's nest. There are looping paths, which combined with the slow walking speed, is a clever way to evoke the feeling of frustration and a lack of progress towards escape. Paper boats are found, raising questions but also hinting at a moment further in the story. As we traverse through this cold, dark map, the eerie glowing colours become more manic and repetitive. The glowing cave art fully transforms into energetic chemical symbols and circuit diagrams. There are references to Damascus expressed in paintings covering the entire passageway out of the cave. It's the intensity of these paintings that reflects the intensity of emotions of our narrator, or his spirit. It visualizes how he is feeling, It feels tight, and it feels like he is descending into mental instability. It makes you feel like you have limited choice but to crawl your way out. And when our protagonist meets the water, we are also met with a dream sequence. It explicitly visualizes the car crash that haunts our narrator's life. As this is quite a poetic game, it affirms to the player that it's very likely that the car crash is reality. With the magically decorated cave environment, we are left to wonder what is real and what is not. Or if the narrator is simply having hallucinations, or is his spirit connecting to the underworld. Either way, as we step into the light, up and out of the cave, we are greeted with our final map. The moon casts its cold embrace on the rocky outskirts of the cave. It's nighttime, the end of the day, as we are reaching the end of the game. It eventually leads us to where the last urn can be found. These petitions, named groins, are made of wood, which limit longshore drift along many of the beaches in the UK. As an Australian used to warm, soft golden sand upon wide open beaches, I've always felt it was very British, but also, in this story, a representation of trying to control the natural order of the world, the shore, but also symbolically, self-purpose, grief and death. Past the groins, we reach a storytelling milestone. Little letters written by the narrator to Esther, shaped as boats. These explicitly represent the narrator attempting to process Esther's passing. We saw them in the cave, floating down and attempting to find their way. This is where they belong. And on to the final section, where the protagonist makes their last descent towards a remnant of people dwelling here. A radio beacon. The beacon is fenced off, yet the danger sign is flipped, warning the player of the island, not of the radio tower. After a steady climb, the narrator leaps off. The narrator takes flight across a panning view of the last map, before heading in the direction of the perfectly placed paper boat letters to Esther in our last moment of the experience. Questions arise. Did he pass too? Or did he fall asleep and this is a dream? Or a wish? Did he process his grief on this island? Did he find purpose? The ending is purposefully ambiguous so the player can make their own conclusions. With the choices the game creators made in the environment, biome, and world, Dear Esther manages to strike a perfect balance of reflecting the denial state of grief. I always feel that worlds are less appreciated as a narrative device compared to characters or stories or even graphics. And so I wanted to pay homage to all the beautifully crafted environments of this game. Whilst not stuffed with game mechanics and interactions, the game creators clearly spent a lot of time researching and reflecting on the world that they have created for their players. They have created a world to hold the story of Dear Esther.